our speaker, Daniel Suman, which has a very strong link to Brazil. Yet, yeah, with several, you have collaboration with several people here in Brazil, so he knows Brazil and has a very strong activity related to conservation, related to biodiversity, related to several aspects that we are focusing now today. Okay, so I would like to invite Daniel to share with you his salt expertise and passion.
Hey, thank
okay,
you.
Daniel, with you, please.
Thanks, Alex. Thank you. Ah, good. You can hear. Yes, and I didn't even remember that, no, but in about 10 years ago, I had a Fulbright fellowship to spend a year in Univali in Itajaí with Poletti, Marcos Poletti. And then back even 15 years ago, we had a CAPES exchange program in coastal management with FURG, UERJ, with Josefa Varela and Milton Asmus, who was here the first week, and then University of Miami, where I'm from, and University of Delaware with Biliana Sisensen. Some of you probably have heard of her as well if you're involved in coastal management. And other things too. But so I'm from University of Miami, the marine science school there, but I work in coastal management, marine protected areas, coastal law, environmental law, and planning, environmental planning. So Alex, just thank you very much, and I congratulate you on this wonderful course. I wish I were a student again and could be here as a student. And congratulations to all of you. I'm just so impressed with your background, your work, your projects, and it's going to be a great future for the marine environment because of you, I know. So I'm going to talk a little bit about marine protected areas. Hopefully finish before the break looking at some biological aspects, international policy aspects of marine protected areas, and then after the break look at some social, political issues. And I want to do that through 5 case studies if we have time, looking at different projects that I've been involved in over 20 years or so, some in the United States and others in Eastern Tropical Pacific in Panama, Ecuador, and Colombia. So marine protected areas, obviously you all know the marine and coastal environment has great problems. I think at least the emblematic ecosystems that experiencing threats are coral reefs, and I'm sure most of you know some of the grave problems that coral reefs face. I think more than 20% have been lost already, and many, many more are under threat. And of course, these are some of the most diverse marine and coastal habitats, coral reefs, tropical coral reefs. And mangroves, so many of you are working in mangroves, I know. Me too. And we have great losses of mangroves. We've lost from about 1980 to 2000, 25% of mangroves throughout the world. So perhaps 20 million hectares in 1980, and now only 15 million hectares today. They're important, of course, for biodiversity, but more important, I would say, for the great ecosystem services that they provide in tropical areas. And of course, yesterday with Fabio and with Anthony, we heard a lot about the fisheries collapses, fisheries problems throughout the world. And I guess it was Tony, or Fabio, I think, in the afternoon, who talked about less than 10% of fish stocks throughout the world are not fully exploited, but then all of the rest are either maxed out or overexploited. And of course, with time, we see increasing fully exploited or overexploited fish stocks. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with Pauly and his hypotheses and theories from UBC, British Columbia. Fishing down the food web to lower trophic levels as part of our activities, from long-lived higher trophic bottom fish to short-lived lower trophic invertebrates. These are all problems that we have in fisheries, and especially critical in areas that have been fished by industrial fisheries for a long time, like the North Atlantic, Northeast, Northwest Atlantic as well. And here, first mention of MPAs, marine protected areas, as one solution that Daniel Pauly mentions to these problems of fishing down the food web. So I'm sure you've seen these graphs over time, and decrease in trophic levels in the world. Basically, this is what we care about, marine environment, from 3.4 to 3. And it's a graphic illustration of that, with time going to lower trophic levels, smaller fish in the marine environment. And yesterday in the afternoon, we talked, Fabio talked about MSY and description of what that means. But the fishing industry has caused depletions as technology has increased, as fishing fleets have expanded their ranges from the northern hemisphere to the southern hemisphere, areas that previously were not exploited as much. So again, catches have increased. Of course, Fabio mentioned how they've leveled off pretty much since the 1980s, since about 1980, because most of the fisheries are fully exploited or overexploited, right? Okay. So we have problems in the ocean, problems because of loss of habitats, loss of biodiversity, and of course, great problems in the fishing industry too. So marine protected areas may be a solution, a partial solution to some of these problems. In fisheries collapses and overfishing. There can be benefits to fisheries management from marine protected areas, and as well, biodiversity losses. MPAs, marine protected areas, can give conservation benefits. So just stepping back and looking at the definition of protected areas, and of course, I think we should go back to World Conservation Union, IUCN, to look at the definition of protected areas, and then MPAs as well. But protected areas are geographical spaces, delineated areas, recognized, dedicated, and managed through law or regulation. So there's a law or regulation that defines the space. And in the afternoon, we have MSP, Marine Spatial Planning, that are long-term, that experience long-term protection, hopefully permanent, but at least long-term protection. Some MPAs have a 10-year window. So, but certainly long-term conservation, where conservation goals are high in the objectives of these areas. Of course, cultural values too may be protected, as well as ecosystem services. So those are just a general definition of protected areas. And of course, marine protected areas will have a broad definition, including intertidal zones, subtidal zones, coastal habitats. Of course, for me, I think for most people, mangroves and coastal wetlands can be MPAs, MPA targets as well. Coastal areas and coastal habitats can be marine protected areas. The water, the substrata, associated flora and fauna, and submerged cultural resources, shipwrecks, archaeological resources can also form part of MPAs and be a basis for their designation. Okay. So if we look, and just, I think important to get the nomenclature right. So marine protected areas, I think, are the areas of the ocean that are protected by law, coastal areas and marine areas that are protected by law with a conservation purpose, they may or may not allow extraction of resources. So a subset of marine protected areas are no take, no extraction zones called marine reserves. So MPAs are the big category of areas that have a conservation goal, and a subset are marine reserves that are no-take areas. This is the general nomenclature that we all should use. However, many countries completely confuse the nomenclature, and in the United States, for instance, National Park Service calls marine reserves natural resource areas. And the National Marine Sanctuary Program calls marine reserves ecological reserves. So, and there are other designations too. So it's very confusing what is actually a marine reserve. But we all should use these definitions. Marine reserve is a no-take area, a subset of MPAs. And if we look, of course, at the IUCN World Conservation Union classifications, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, perhaps 1 to 3, categories 1 to 3 of these protected area classifications could be marine reserves, no-take marine reserves. So strict nature preserves that only allow scientific activities, or wilderness areas where people, marine wilderness areas where people have very little impact, or national parks that protect significant natural resources of an area and also allow people to enjoy them, or national monuments or features, which are similar to national parks but don't include as large of an ecosystem. 4, 5, and 6 can be areas that allow that allow extraction of resources and sustainable use, of course, which I think we're all very interested in, right? 4, 5, and 6 as well. So I believe it was Tony in the morning that mentioned taking a look at the international sphere and goals that we have as an international community. Tony mentioned the Millennium Development Goals first, and then Sustainable Development Goals that are driving the international conversation in development areas, and certainly in environmental areas. So Sustainable Development Goals, one of the goals back then was to designate 10% of the global ocean as an MPA by 2010. Well, it didn't happen. And then he also mentioned the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the Conference of the Party, 10th Conference of the Parties, COP10 in Japan, that adopted the Aichi biodiversity targets. So here we see again this 10% target, right? By 2020, at least 10% of coastal and marine areas should be protected with effective area-based conservation measures. So a 10% target for protecting coastal and marine areas through CBD, through the Convention on Biological Diversity, and then, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals that UN General Assembly approved in 2015, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that we talked about yesterday, that cover all fields of human endeavor and resource use and protection, ending poverty, protecting the environment, addressing climate change, and we see goals 2016 to 2030. Well, the MPA goals have targets that have a target date of 2020. Okay, so implementation involves everyone: IOs, international organizations, governments, the private sector as well, from all countries, the rich countries in the north and developing countries as well. And of course, the SDG, Sustainable Development Goals, are not legally binding, but everyone is expected to work toward achieving these targets. And we've seen this yesterday. 14, Life Below Water, in our discussion about the title to Life Below Water and the links between the marine environment and all of these other goal areas. And there are five or six different targets within Sustainable Development Goal 14. But the one that's of most concern to us, or there are two, but especially this one, by 2020, conserve at least 10% of coastal and marine areas consistent with national and international law, based on the best available science. So conserve 10% of the ocean and coastal ocean as a protected area, not necessarily a marine reserve, but as a protected area by 2020. And one of the articles that I sent that some of you may have already read, but will be on the website, I think, is this very short article, 2-page article from Science Magazine by Jane Lubchenco from OSU, Oregon State University, that says, okay, if we look at areas within the territorial sea and exclusive economic zone, so not areas in the high seas, but areas under national jurisdiction, maybe we should look more carefully at this and see how we're doing today, right? So she suggests that most areas are only lightly protected and allow a great extractive activity. And she says the second category is strongly protected, which continues to allow artisanal fishing or recreational fishing, and then fully protected would be marine reserves, no extracted activities. So if we look more closely at the fully protected area, we see that we're not doing so well today. And so looking at data today from the over 10,000 MPAs that have been created throughout the world, today about 3.5% of the ocean has some kind of conservation goal, some kind of conservation protection. But if we only look at the subcategories, so this would be categories 1, 2, and 3, lightly protected, strongly protected, and fully protected. But if we look at strongly protected and fully protected MPAs, we see that only 1%, 1.6% of the ocean is strongly or fully protected. But this is better than it was 15 years ago, right? When only 0.1% of the ocean was strongly or fully protected. And then, of course, if we look at these MPA areas, and specifically the marine reserves, we see that most of them, the great majority today, are within areas of national jurisdiction. In other words, territorial seas and exclusive economic zone, but not in the high seas, which is an area that is largely open to future negotiation and future international action. Okay. So, from planet ocean, red represent time, percent of the world's ocean that enjoys some kind of conservation, protection. We see an increase in protection in the last 15 or 20 years, but still very, very small green area. And this is a graph from the World Bank website that looks at protected areas, MPAs, in areas of national jurisdiction, so territorial seas and exclusive economic zone. And I just highlighted some Western Hemisphere nations, Latin America and the Caribbean, about 15% within their areas of national jurisdiction, and Brazil 20%, the US about 30%, and Canada on the low end, about 2% or so. Of course, you know, we really have to take a deeper look at the reality than just the numbers, right? Because it's more important to look at effectiveness of the marine protected areas, not the official designation, which is often meaningless because we have paper parks or paper marine parks too. But anyway, the good thing is that we see progress since 1990, great progress in the designation of MPAs. And by country, also from the World Bank. The bluer countries have greater percentages of their areas under national jurisdiction as protected areas. So some Western European countries, Ecuador with Galapagos, of course, boost them up significantly. Brazil, Australia, the US. So how are we doing? Well, we've improved a lot, at least in designation of MPAs in the last 25 years. But most MPAs are in areas of national jurisdiction. But it doesn't seem likely that we'll meet the targets, the Aichi target or the Sustainable Development Goal 14 target by 2020. Nevertheless, I think they're useful targets to show that at least we're moving ahead. We have to work on effectiveness, but I think it's a good indicator. Of course, recognizing that we have plenty of paper MPAs, paper marine protected areas. I'm thinking of two that was designated in Panama a few years ago in the exclusive economic zone, last year actually. And they're squares, very large squares that someone in an office drew. Someone who you will meet at OSU, some of you, in a few weeks. And of course, enforcement capabilities are absent. And as far as an ecosystem basis for designating those areas, there's really none either. So we have plenty of paper MPAs in the world. I think it's interesting just to take a quick look at the difference. What's the difference between a land terrestrial protected area and a marine protected area? And of course, we're used to the idea of protection of space on land and not quite as used to it in the ocean. So on land, we have about globally protected areas between 10 and 15%. But if we add up all of the areas in the marine environment, even those that are lightly protected and paper MPAs, well, it's only 3% today. And why is the difference? Any idea? Why we have perhaps 15% of land areas that enjoy some kind of conservation protection and only 3% max marine areas that enjoy some kind of protection? Any idea? Yeah.
Maybe because there's no clear boundaries as to where the jurisdiction of one country begins and ends.
Okay, that's good because 58-60% of the world ocean is high seas, right? So certainly open access global commons area. While no land, well, except Antarctica, we would consider a global commons. Yeah. Yes.
Maybe because in land there is easy access, human beings have easy access to the resources than in water.
So people have easier access to the resources on land and people live on land. And we're used to being on land. Yes.
It's a newer concept that is being introduced.
And any others?
Maybe it's too difficult to enforce the laws or to inspect.
Enforcement is really difficult. Well, of course, in the high seas, tremendous difficulties with enforcement. And how can we enforce areas that are outside national jurisdiction? But even in the exclusive economic zone or territorial sea, enforcement is very, very tough compared to on land, and very costly as well. Even in rich countries, it's expensive and difficult, right? So that, and we could think of other reasons too, but just some of the differences, biological and political, social differences between land ecosystems and marine ecosystems. Well, the big difference is we have this aqueous medium, this fluid medium that transports materials, larvae, in and out of marine reserves, right? So we have openness in marine ecosystems, much more openness than on land. And generally, marine ecosystems are 3Ds, three-dimensional, also having depth, while terrestrial ecosystems are generally on the surface of land. So we have that difference too. And of course, with this open aqueous structure medium in the marine environment, we have greater transport in and out of pollutants, nutrients, fish, larvae, juveniles, whatever. Okay? Rate of environmental variability in the ocean faster than on land. And as far as recruitment of new individuals to population, it's higher on the ocean. Our external recruitment is higher on the ocean than on land. And fecundity of invertebrates, higher in the marine environment than on land. And of course, because of this fluid aqueous medium, conductivity is so important in the marine environment. So greater issues of conductivity inside and outside the area in the marine system than on land. And then getting into some social political issues. We're used to private property on land, but really marine ecosystems, the marine environment is generally owned by all of us or owned by the state or in some instances the province, right? So public ownership of marine space and access, we're much more used to closed areas, private areas on land, but many people see the marine space as open access. And habitat destruction, of course, is great in both, but great in terrestrial environment, but focused locally in the marine environment. So, on to a few biological issues. Yeah?
What do you mean by locally focused? Just the last.
What is locally focused? Let's see. Oh, here. I think that by this habitat destruction being locally focused, I mean that generally the area of direct human influence is relatively smaller in the marine environment than on land. That's not to say that there aren't great impacts from dredging or whatever activity is occurring in the marine environment outside, right? But the general area of human disturbance, of direct human disturbance in the marine environment is more focused and smaller. Direct human intervention, I think. Yeah.
Can you also say that these differences are also due to the difficulties we have in defining the... okay, so can you also say that these differences are also due to the difficulties we have in defining marine ecosystems? Because in land we can define by satellite images basically, and then in marine environments it's not that easy.
Okay, I think so. That makes sense. Any other differences? There are plenty more, but those are just scratching the surface a little bit. So just some biological issues with marine reserves, and here talking about no-take, no-extractive, non-extractive areas, marine reserves, right? What are some of the benefits of marine reserves? And now there's quite an increasing literature, scientific literature, on some of the biological impacts and biological benefits of marine reserves to fisheries and to biodiversity, to conservation. I'm sure that a lot of you are already familiar with them, but included some summary articles on the materials that will be on the website. So I won't really refer directly to the articles, but just to some of the conclusions from some of them, right? What are the benefits, biological benefits of marine reserves? Well, larval dispersal is certainly a big one. The dispersal of larvae from fisheries and invertebrates outside the marine reserve, right? Replenishing other areas. And here, we have to talk about replenishment of the reserve itself and then replenishment to other areas outside. So larval export can certainly enhance fisheries, and the distance that larvae can travel will depend on the species, how long different larvae spend in that stage. Depends on the species, and of course, ocean currents will also affect dispersal issues, right? But a number of people suggest that generally for coral reef fish, the distance of dispersal is between 10 and 100 kilometers. And of course, once we don't fish in an area, then the abundance of fish, the biomass increases, the size of individuals increase, and larger fish produce more eggs that are of higher quality with higher fat content. So a number of benefits from larval dispersion. And spillover. So by spillover, we're not really talking about larval dispersion as much, but more the export, density-driven export of adults or juveniles outside of the reserve. And there have been a number of observations that have detected an edge effect. In other words, fish swim out of the reserve, and then, of course, if no fishing is allowed in the reserve, then boats congregate around the reserve in an area where fish are more abundant because they're swimming outside the reserve. So spillover into adjacent areas, and there are some old examples. In Florida, in the US, the oldest marine reserve is really a national wildlife refuge near the Kennedy Space Center that was closed, has been closed since 1963, but for national security reasons. And then because of this closure, there has been an increasing number of record-sized game fish like marlin or drum, red drum, whatever, in adjacent waters. And many other examples from St. Lucia as well. Soufriere Marine Management Area has increased artisanal catch significantly. So here is Cape Kennedy Space Center, and the closed area is here. And these are International Game Fish Association records for trophy species of spotted sea trout, red drum, black drum, and snook. And they seem to be concentrated near the closed area in the National Wildlife Refuge here, there, here, and there, and as well around the southern part of Florida, which is Everglades National Park. It is not, fishing is highly restricted and managed, but it's not closed, so there is extraction there. Anyway, so this, I think, is one evidence of a closed area, 40 square kilometers, that has increased fishing in adjacent waters. In insurance, it's a good insurance policy. Marine reserves are a good insurance policy in case there are collapses due to environmental conditions or to overfishing or disease or whatever. It's a good insurance policy. If traditional fishery management techniques fail, like the whole suite of fishery management techniques, all the size limits, quotas, restrictions on boats, limited entry, and all of the whole suite of fishery management techniques, if they all fail, then we have marine reserves. is a good insurance policy. And of course, a really interesting area that's been developing a lot in recent years has been networks of marine reserves, and certainly open for great research opportunities as well. So I think there are greater benefits if we have a network of marine reserves, network of no-take areas, much greater benefits than if we have a single marine reserve. Networks can span political boundaries. In the Caribbean, you could imagine that we might have a larval export area for spiny lobster in Belize. Why not? And then could be exported to Yucatan, to Mexico, or Cuba exported to Florida. That would be interesting in the US, right? So anyway, networks can expand political boundaries, national political boundaries, and they can also expand habitat boundaries from nearshore areas out to deeper waters. And what is connected in networks? Well, adults, juveniles, or larvae could be transported from one area to another. The idea then would be to place the no-take marine reserves at a logical distance that would ensure that whatever is displaced reaches the adjacent network downstream. We're talking about upstream areas, replenishment within a reserve or outside a reserve from an upstream area to a downstream area. Obviously, if we have some area, a coral reef with a very large upstream area, it can be more resilient because it could be, if well placed, replenished by this upstream source of larvae or juveniles. So networks of marine reserves are thought of as being much more important and much more beneficial to fisheries and even to biodiversity than single reserves. Of course, they have to be well placed, close enough so that we can have replenishment from an upstream source of larvae to a downstream source. California has recently established in the US a network of marine reserves. Not here, they are, at least dots representing the different reserves, with attempts to look at conductivity, but not necessarily, because there's a lot of opportunistic designation of marine reserves and MPAs every place in California, or every place actually. So, okay, marine reserves can have fisheries benefits, but also benefits to biodiversity, because if we close an area to extractive activities, then obviously biodiversity will increase. We'll have greater species richness, greater size of individuals, greater biomass, and larger individuals. And there's new evidence as well that also talks about spillover, enhancing biodiversity in adjacent areas, not only of individuals for fisheries management, but also enhancing biodiversity beyond their boundaries. Now, forgetting about conservation and about fisheries, which are the major benefits of marine reserves, we also have others, benefits to certain activities, certain economic activities, like the dive industry, for instance, or recreation, environmental education and science research. Often scientists say, okay, if we really want to test marine reserves and the benefits of marine reserves, we need a control area, that we fully protect, and then compare that to an area that's fished. Seascapes for beauty, I guess, as well, aesthetics. In some cases, they can reduce user conflicts. And of course, then they can create conflicts as well, as you know, we'll talk about after the break. Could anyone imagine some use of MPAs or marine reserves that would reduce user conflict between different marine resource users? Any possibility? Separating uses in space, in marine space, so that they don't conflict. Okay, I can think of one. Let's say a dive site. right? Recreational diving. It would be nice if you're a recreational diver. Well, of course, you would like to see big fish and wonderful coral reefs, right? But you would also not like to have a trawl boat drag the net over your area, or somebody fish using some kind of gill net or whatever in the area where you're diving, right? So there could be, we could separate those uses, coral reefs that are interesting dive sites, and certain fishing art, certain fishing activities to reduce that conflict between recreational diving and fishing. Any other possibilities? Some you mentioned yesterday. Yeah.
Yes, yesterday you mentioned about in Mexico dividing the lobster sites for different.
Lobster sites in Mexico.
Yes, a park or a reserve in Mexico that the different community, the park was divided so the community could have like parcels for extracting lobsters. Would that be?
So it could be, no, I'm not sure of that example yesterday that we talked about, but just to clarify the traditional use rights of different communities. For this community has this space, another community or fishing colony cooperative has this space.
Yes.
Reducing the conflict between communities?
Yes, between the users in the community, yes.
Yes, that would be another example. Another would be the same in lobster fishery in Maine, in the United States, that is an example of co-management. Of course, the state regulates lobster fishing, but communities have their own self-regulation, traditional techniques, right? This is our community's area for trapping lobster, right? And this other fjord, let's say, is the traditional area of another community. And if I'm from community B and fish for lobster in community A, then something might happen to me, like lobstermen from community A might cut my nets, cut the buoys to my net, or cut the buoys to my trap, or hopefully nothing worse than that, right? Just arguments, or in some cases there's been violence from people in a community who are protecting their traditional area against interlopers from outside. But oil rigs as well. Oil rigs or wind farms in the ocean wind farms have an exclusive area that restricts other activities around them for safety or for other purposes. So, income generation, possibly for some groups. And it's easier, could be easier, easier type of fishery management. So an enforcer says, okay, you are fishing in this area or you are not fishing in this area. It's similar than looking at the number of fish you have or the size of fish or other traditional fishery management techniques. So to a certain extent, marine reserves are a simpler fishery management tool. Okay, one other point. How would we select marine reserves? There are so many different criteria that we could use. Without looking, can you think of one? Anyone suggest some? Actually, some are here. Would like to have representative biogeographical regions, of marine biogeographical regions. Would like to have represent different habitats in the biogeographical region. We'd like to protect centers of endemism, areas where there's species of limited range, and hotspots. CI, Conservation International, has listed 25 areas of global biodiversity hotspots, terrestrial. And we also have areas that are marine biodiversity hotspots. And it seems like it will be really important to target marine reserves for those areas, especially in Southeast Asia, the Coral Triangle, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, in that area. And sites that have a high percentage of a population of a species. That's certainly one of the criteria for designating wetlands of international importance under the Ramsar Convention, if we're talking about birds. So, any other possibilities? Areas that we might, yeah. Spawning sites, spawning aggregation sites. There might be certain areas of the ocean that are critical areas for some life cycle stage of a species. Spawning aggregation sites would be, very important area to protect. Certain migration corridors where we have species congregation, or mating sites, which would be spawning aggregation sites, but thinking about turtles, or nursery areas as well. Protecting these areas, critical areas in the life cycle of species, that would be another possibility. Any others? Areas that have populations, significant populations of critically endangered, IUCN Red Book, Red List, critically endangered, or threatened species. So areas that are really important for endangered and threatened species. Any others? Yeah.
I have a question actually.
Okay.
Why don't we make all ecosystems an MPA, every ecosystem? Why can't we do that? I mean, at the end, we have MPAs and we have non-MPA regions. And at the end, these non-MPA areas will face, will be threatened as well. So
Right.
why don't we do it before it happens?
Well, I see what you mean. Why don't we have elevate conservation goals as the priority in all areas of the ocean, because there are other economic activities that are also.
Discrimination.
You think so? Yeah. I mean, we have areas that are important for maritime transportation, for Navy activities, for oil and gas and sand mining and all sorts of economic activities that are, it's all a trade-off.
So we let the other areas get overexploited and then they get overexploited. Okay, now this is an MPA. You just name it. I don't think it's fair.
Yeah. But anyway, I think it's all a trade-off, between economic development and conservation. I think it would be wonderful if the whole ocean was an MPA, but it's not practical, right? I don't think. Okay. Sites that are important. This could be spawning aggregation sites. Sites that are important as for larval export. And highly vulnerable sites too. Sites that are important for some of these other regions that are highly vulnerable. Could also be good targets. And of course, if we're talking about networks of MPAs, then we have the conductivity issues. How do we select sites that can be part of a network of a marine reserve? And when you read some of the articles, some that will be on the website, we see the biologists, the marine reserve biologists saying that, okay, what we really have to do is select sites for MPAs that are important biologically, and then let the user groups have their opportunity to criticize them. So the second point, propose alternatives before considering the biases from stakeholder input. I don't necessarily agree with that, because everything is a trade-off, and user groups and stakeholder groups have their livelihoods that they need to protect. So maybe it is possible to have, in the overall, the net benefit is good to have a trade-off between what is ideal ecologically and what is ideal for fisheries. Many MPAs, as you probably know, are created because it was just opportunistic, easy to create, no great conflicts with user groups. Let's just do it, especially at the end of our presidential term, right? We have many examples of that. And maybe we want to think about size, which is, of course, another great area for research in marine protected areas. What's the ideal size? Is larger better, or is intermediate size better? But of course, many small reserves would be harder to manage and enforce than a large reserve too. So we have to think about the institutional capacity, the management capacity to manage and enforce the areas. Okay, what time? How much before the break? Half an hour, okay. So what I want to do is look at some political and social issues, but frame them in 5 different case studies of different projects, different marine reserves, MPAs, and marine reserves, and look at some of the details. And there are some details, so I'll quickly skip by some of the details, but give you a sense of some of these governance issues or user group conflicts, community involvement, enforcement issues in MPAs, but based on different case studies, ones that I've been involved in. So here they are. Here are some different themes. And of course, it's hard to separate them all, but I use this one, Coiba National Park. This is in Panama, to illustrate governance issues. And then another Panama case, the Panama Bay Wildlife Refuge, also a Ramsar site, wetland of international importance, as an example of institutional fragmentation and lack of political will. And use the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, this is in Florida in the US, as one example of community involvement and increasing sensitivity of the government authority to concerns of the community, and greater acceptance of the community to the concept of the MPA and marine reserves. A recent interesting failure, at least so far, has been Biscayne National Park. This is in Florida, because of very strong opposition from recreational fishers, sports fishers, to creating a marine reserve. And then some financing concerns. You know, if we're going to have a marine reserve or an MPA, we have to have sustainable funding for that reserve. That's often a problem, well, with many different environmental initiatives, not just MPAs. And enforcement, ETP, Eastern Tropical Pacific Marine Corridor. This is an example of a marine area under national jurisdiction, but high seas as well, sort of connecting Costa Rica, Panama, Colombia, and Galapagos and Ecuador. And then some monitoring and research concerns at the end, if there's time. So let's see. Coiba, I think, is a good jumping off point to look at governance of a marine area. And of course, there are great challenges to governance in an MPA, what is governance again? We talked about it yesterday with Tony. How we make decisions, who makes decisions, who's included, what laws and regulations exist, institutional mandates and authority, competence over an area, and all of this, everything is governance. Well, there are challenges to governing an MPA, especially ones that are near the coast, even ones that are not so near the coast, because of land and sea issues, especially coastal areas, right? And we have to, of course, in coastal management too, or in MPAs, have to integrate land and water. And of course, there can be off-site impacts as well. Yesterday we were talking a bit about this, right? You have a protected area, but then off-site activities influence the environmental quality of the area, entry of pollutants or whatever. Institutional coordination is often very, very tough. because in coastal areas or the marine environment there may be many different sectors, economic sectors or interest sectors that are managed by different institutions. And how can we get them to work together or at least coordinate their activities? And here, this whole issue of users, local communities, and the general public. What mechanisms can we use to include them in the process? What public participation mechanisms? How much do we want to include the public? In what stages of the process and all of this? And of course, one big challenge is this general perception among many people and users that the ocean is open access, the marine space is open access, and we're all free to go there, right? And do whatever we want. Okay, so looking at here this example of Coiba National Park, here it is. Actually, the national park is inside the red point, so it includes this island, which is pretty big, 500 square kilometers, and a marine area which is about over 2,000 square kilometers all around here. And here it is for those of you who don't know Central America very well. This is Panama, Colombia, Costa Rica, and Eastern Tropical Pacific, but this is Coiba Island, and the national park is there. So it's the largest island in the Pacific Ocean off Central America, from Mexico to Panama, and it has the greatest extent of coral reefs off Central America, Pacific side. 17 square kilometers of coral reefs, largest in the Eastern Tropical Pacific. And interesting thing about Coiba was that, well, it was created in 1991, not by law, but by resolution, by, say, regulation. And then a law, which we call Coiba Law, in 2004. But there were no permanent residents on the island, except for pre-Columbian residents, but no permanent residents in recent time, because it was a prison. It was a penal colony until 2004. So similar to some islands like Gorgona Mapelo, Gorgona, right, in Colombia, that was also a prison, and is now a protected area. So including the main island and other islands and marine space, an interesting area. So now a national park. And soon after the Coiba Law in 2004, it was declared as a natural World Heritage Site by UNESCO. Many sea turtles, marine mammals occupy the marine area. And we worked on a management plan soon after the Coiba Law for a couple of years, and it was finally approved by the government in 2009. There are interesting cultural resources there too. The prison buildings and all are really interesting, but unfortunately are not being protected. Okay, so here's a map of Coiba, and this is the national park here. This is an area associated with it, which is sort of a marine buffer zone, but the park itself is this area, and you can't really see, but there's a 1 kilometer marine reserve, no-take area around the island, and then regulated fisheries, highly regulated sports fisheries around it, and an area that's designated to dolphin fish here by local communities. So this is an exclusive area for long lining by local communities here, which can travel by boat in about an hour and a half from Remedios to this area here. Okay. So we have a lot of questions about governance here. Who's going to make the decisions? How do we assign user rights? Who gets access? If we allow extraction in the MPA, not in the marine reserve, but how do we set the limits? What are the limits of extraction? Who's going to decide? How are the decisions reached? What are the goals that we're trying to implement by all of the actions? And what are the outside forces that are exerting pressure on decision making? And here I think this is a great example of outside forces exerting pressure on conservation goals of this national park, as you'll see. So we've been interested in inclusion, representation of different user groups in the decision-making process. Is it open to everyone? Is the decision-making process open to everyone, to the public, general public, or people not in the table, the decision-making table? And who can participate? Affected groups, interested groups, all of the users, the direct stakeholders, or other interested people. So we characterized decision-making and looked at the mandates of the law and tried to develop some indicators to measure governance indicators. So I'm sure you're all familiar with biological indicators to measure the success, the progress of a management plan or protected area, or social indicators to look at the well-being, livelihoods of communities that we talked about yesterday in the morning, and also governance indicators too, to try to gauge the decision-making process and evaluate it and see how we're doing. I think it's really tough. It's easier to look at biological indicators, but tougher to look at the decision-making process and develop some quantitative guideline, but this is what we tried to do. So the law itself, this Law 44, the COIBA law, said that created a management council, which was new in Panama. I know that in your countries, well, in Brazil and in the US now, and many other countries, there is a management council that makes decisions about a protected area. But this was new in Panama in 2004. A new experience with co-management. And at that time, the environmental agency was ANAM, National Environmental Authority. Like Fabio mentioned in the afternoon, there's been a tremendous flux of institutional changes. Fabio had a diagram of fisheries management in Brazil and how it had gone through so many loops and changes in 10 years. And in Panama, the same thing. 4 different agencies have been responsible for protected areas and coastal management in the last 20 years, creating great lack of institutional stability. Okay, so a management council was created to make decisions, but then the operation of the park, the operational level, was the responsibility of the Environment Authority, ANAM. And the Management Council established policies, approved the management plan, is seeing the implementation of the management plan, and evaluates the scientific research management plan, and looks at finances, because this protected area also created a fund called the COIBA Fund that was populated by entry fees and by projects in the area too. And then this fund was supposed to be shared among local municipalities outside the reserve, right? It hasn't worked, and there's still no 10 years later, still no regulation of the fund, all of the monies. So, a management council, and you see that many different central government agencies were part of the management council. Municipalities in the area, their representatives were part of the management council. The governor of the province where the fishing communities were, it was also a member. And then NGOs, environmental NGOs like Marviva, and scientific research, the Smithsonian, University of Panama, and one representative of the fishing sector. So really inclusive, but heavily oriented to government representatives. And then there's a regulation defining the management, or the responsibilities, operation of the Management Council, and also a scientific committee. Yeah, a scientific committee that works with the Management Council, and a Fisheries Commission that works with the Management Council too. So these three committees work together, and the Fisheries Commission works in that zone to the west that I show you. It's not part of the park, but it's a special zone of marine protection. This area here. So this is the national park, and this is the special zone of marine protection, which allows commercial fishing, sports fishing, and was presided by a different agency, not the environmental agency. Okay, so thinking of governance indicators, we wanted to improve decision-making, improve the institutional behavior, and also look at how decisions were being made and developing some indicators of past actions, and then these indicators were incorporated into the management plan to evaluate progress in decision-making. And some that we looked at were level of attendance at the meetings of the different reps, how often meetings occurred, how consistent the membership was, because you could have, say, university representative, one person, the same person always goes to the meetings. Or you could have the Ministry of, Government and Justice that sends a different person to every meetings, which is not very good for institutional memory or for consistent decision-making and positioning of the institution. How well did they comply with the agenda? There were minutes. How often were they distributed? Were they distributed? What themes were discussed? What decisions were adopted? And what was the level of compliance with decisions? Let me just show you some of the results from the analysis. So location of the meetings, and that made a big difference, because you'll see the attendance of some members was not great. So where were the meetings? Were they on the island, which is a 2-hour boat ride from the mainland in rough waters, or were they in the local municipalities? That makes a difference in who's going to attend, especially if the mayor, is not really interested, only interested in the money of the fund, right, which he or she is not getting because it's not regulated. So where are the meetings taking place? And here, these were on the island, and these were in Panama City, which is 6 hours away from this province. Attendance at the meetings, and you'll see there was a quorum of 7. So you have to have 7 people making a decision there before a decision is made. And there were some meetings that only had 5 people, right? And perhaps those were meetings in Panama City. Anyway. And the attendance of the group, the Environment Authority was always there. Marviva, Environmental Group was always there. They were the secretary. But attendance was pretty low by the mayors of some of the municipalities, right? Just 20%. Really low here. So that was a big problem. And we wondered, well, how has it happened? Has it been improving over time? Not really. Actually, say the Chamber of Commerce has stopped coming, basically. Some of the members have a vote, and some are just without vote, and that makes a difference. And was there a quorum of 7? You see there were some meetings without a quorum. That's not so great. And this is sort of a representation index that we devised. In other words, how consistent is the representative for the different groups? And you see that Ministry of Government and Justice switched every time almost. And even the Environment Authority switched their representation, but at least they were there. And public participation. You know, it was really interesting that here we have this decision-making body, and you may think that the public should be able to attend, right? Like to have the public, okay, maybe they can't say anything, maybe they can ask some questions at the end, but they'll sit back there or sit over here. But actually the regulation for the council said the public could not attend. You know, you have to get special permission if you're a non-member to attend the meeting, you know, right in advance. And pretty crazy. But you see there were some visitors who attended or some invited people who attend here. But generally the public was not allowed. The public was only allowed with special permission at these meetings. And then based on some of these findings, then we developed different recommendations to strengthen the management council in their decision-making operations. Here are some. This used to be the prison. I think they've knocked it down. Okay, so some of the recommendations were improving the coordination between the scientific council, the fisheries group, and the management council. And actually, these committees, science and the fisheries, had very few meetings. They weren't very efficient. They didn't get the minutes out. Be really strategic about where the meeting is. Does it have to be in Panama City, 5 hours away, or can it be local? How to improve attendance at the meetings. Try to emphasize to the members that they have a responsibility to their group, that they're on this management council and that they have a responsibility to report back to their group and to get their group involved in the process. Tell the group what's happening. Increase transparency to the public of what's happening. And of course there are costs involved, the transportation costs, the costs of holding the meetings and all of this, but they weren't included in the budget. So internalize the costs, all of the transactional costs in the budget. And one big issue was the fund. This money, this fund for entrance fees, which was supposed to be shared among the municipalities, and there was no still has been no regulation for that fund. And critically assess new issues, which has not happened, as we'll see. Okay. So, we have some marine reserves, as I said. 1 kilometer around the island is a no-take area. And then there's an area zoned exclusively for fishers using gill nets, using long lining, one area. NGOs are really, really active in the development of the management plan, but also in microfinancing projects in communities in the buffer zone outside the national park on the mainland, right? And these, were TNC, Nature Conservancy, Marviva, CSF, Conservation International, all were involved in microfinancing projects for small hotels, boat owners, dive shops, smaller restaurants. Surf shops too, because it's a great surfing area, as some of you probably know. Okay, but what has happened recently? Well, in the last 2 years, the president, whose term ends next year, has been floating around the idea of granting a concession in the national park. And concessions are not necessarily bad, but this would be a concession to a luxury hotel, 5-star luxury hotel, building an airstrip in the national park, too, on the island. And of course, this is an important national park, also a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But all of this talk and this action movement to granting a concession has occurred outside the Management Council, The Management Council, by law, has the authority to make all decisions about the national park. And the president and private interests are trying to push this outside the management park. Last year, the Minister of the Environment was sacked, was replaced, because she did not agree with this idea of a luxury resort. And now the new Minister of the Environment is saying, no, we have to be open to, they call it ecotourism, a 5-star luxury hotel and airport, ecotourism. We have to be open to this in our national parks. As another former president said before this one, what good are protected areas if they don't create money, right? So Panama for sale. Anyway, so now there appears to be lack of political will to protecting this park, and it is likely to be on the UNESCO World Heritage Site in danger list soon. So I think a great place to stop, and want to talk about, after the break, about this, another example, which has a happy ending, but not so happy ending, which is the Ramsar site, but very different pressures here. Any questions or thoughts? Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Luis, from Brazil. And in other NPAs, it's possible to apply, for example, the ecology of fear for fishes to measure if the region is protected or not, most based in the native behavior of the animals. But in new NPAs, mostly those that were created in areas most impacted, this kind of behavior doesn't occur, and in our institutions, mostly doesn't have so money and structure to monitoring, especially the large ones, NPAs. So can we really ensure that they are working without structure?
Without
money, birds, structure, boats?
No, I don't think so. But, of course, the possibility that we talked about in the afternoon, and especially in the morning, with community involvement, is certainly one option that can provide protection without necessarily involving such a large top-down budget. Protection of the area, management, protection of the area by local stewards who consider the area to be theirs, that have some exclusive small impact use rights, the turf issue.
Okay, thank you.
Other? But there are possibilities for financing too, unique, innovative financing schemes that we might think about. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Mariana from Brazil. I got curious about, can you explain me better this representation index, please?
Because the issue that we noticed was that at the meetings there would always be, for many institutions or many groups that were represented on the council, there'd always be a new person. And that person was not familiar with what happened at the last meeting. Of course there were minutes, but who reads them? Often they don't, right? So there would be a new person at the next meeting, and therefore there would not be that continuity with topics that were being discussed, being familiar with the other people on the council and having those personal relationships. And this index was tried to represent the continuity of attendance by a single person on the council. Did I explain it?
Yeah,
How consistent?
maybe I find you in coffee break for the math. just to know the calculus, the math.
Oh, how?
Which numbers you use.
Oh, okay. Let me see.
I don't know if you want to explain now. People maybe
Yeah, I
has
can
more
try. I think
questions.
it should be easy.
I don't know. Okay.
That one, yeah. Okay, yeah, so that was easy. So just in all of the meetings that we looked at, right, I think there were over 40 meetings, right? The mayor of Rio de Jesus, there were two different people who represented the municipality of Rio de Jesus. Let's see, the Ministry of Government and Justice, in all of those meetings had 8 different people. So there was a switch of representatives who didn't necessarily understand what was happening. You know, they had to start from zero. Yeah. It's good to have continuity, I think. Yeah. Any more question or thought? No? Then great time for a break.